He'd been cooling his heels in a security booth for about 5 minutes, when the marshal from earlier stepped in and dismissed the MP that had been glaring malevolently at him the entire time. "I see you've got my omnipad," he noted absently, drumming his heels against the legs of the oversized chair he'd been handcuffed to. Which was less than ideal, but far from an unexpected outcome of his little tirade. "You dropped it as you were being escorted off stage," the imposing woman responded simply, her many medals glinting in the overhead light. He shrugged. "You mean it flew out of my hands when your oversized gorilla back there tackled me?" Which hadn't been fun, any more than being frog-marched backstage was afterward. His only solace in this situation was that the shouting from the crowd had only gotten louder after he'd been tackled, and that technically the law was on his side here. He checked, repeatedly. Unfortunately for him, he was also tempering that knowledge with the knowledge that the law tended to warp around people of privilege and power. He liked to have said that was a purely imperial thing, but he had a feeling it had been just as true in the days of old Earth as it was now. "I have no idea what a gorilla is, but I can assume from your tone that it wasn't a complimentary comparison," the woman noted dryly. "You assume correctly." The woman chuckled a little at that, as she eyed him oddly. For his part, he simply stared back. "You aren't what I expected," she said finally. He shrugged as best he could while handcuffed to his seat. "It's true. I'm even more devilishly handsome in person." It was funny. Less than a day ago, he'd never have been as flippant as this with even a lieutenant, let alone a marine marshal. Yet now that he was no longer a soldier, he felt free. Free to be as annoying as possible. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't reveling in the sensation, or that he thought this wasn't a terrible idea, or that he would stop because of it. It was just too damn cathartic. The woman restrained her action to a small snort. "No, I don't think that was what I was referring to, even if I don't disagree. I'm referring to your psychological profile." She flitted through his on the pad. "Your previous COs all seemed to think of you as a study in contrasts. A man who was happy to knuckle down and work, outwardly respectful, understanding of the chain of command, yet with a propensity for independent action that was concerning." Despite himself, he smiled. "Did TC write that last bit? That sounded like TC. Captain TC, the woman corrected. Did indeed write that last part of your profile." He quirked an eyebrow. What did TC's former rank matter? Hell, if she was going to mention it, then he'd point out that he'd been entirely correct in referring to her as just TC. Unfortunately, she continued before he could ask. "I must admit, I was looking forward to having you in my academy. For all that some of my more high-bound colleagues complained of upstarts violating the sanctity of her halls, I was ever more of the opinion that Blackstone might benefit from insight into human eccentricity." This time it was his turn to snort. "Is that what they're calling it now?" She simply inclined her head. "While your people are new on the scene, you have slowly started to garner a reputation for more than just licentiousness. As many soldiers back on Earth can attest, you also have a propensity for outside-the-box thinking and spontaneity." "Well, I like to think I'm nothing if not the prototypical man." This time the woman didn't laugh. She just stared at him, before reaching forward and undoing his cuffs with a simple swipe of her thumb on the fingerprint scanner. His eyes widened as the restraints fell away, and almost subconsciously he reached up to massage his wrists. The damn things had been tight. Perhaps his MP escort had been less than appreciative of being called a wart-riddled buffalo immediately after she tackled him. He supposed he'd never know. "You're free to go, Jason Linford. All of your documents check out." The woman handed back his datapad, and he took it gingerly. "Huh. Surprise," coloured his features. "Part of me thought I'd be here longer." Or that they'd try and trump up some charges for him. Sure, he hadn't technically broken any laws, but he'd skirted a few. Public profanity, incitement to riot, disturbing the peace, slander. The last one wasn't technically a law, but he had a feeling that if anyone could make it one, it would be a pissed-off imperial princess. And he wasn't ignorant enough to think that she'd already been informed of his response to her offer. The Imperial Palace was only a few miles away. Hell, if he drove a few minutes down the road, he'd be able to see where the HMS Victory sat on the Imperial Lake. "I also thought you'd be angrier," he noted, as he stood up. The Marshal just laughed. Do you really think you're the only soldier who's ever thought to tell their superiors to eat their cunt? Then the mirth in her face and in her voice turned deadly serious. Of course. The difference is that soldiers don't indulge that desire. If not out of respect for their superiors, then for the insinuation they represent. Her eyes narrowed. An institution you insulted gravely with your actions here tonight. Despite his discomfort under her gaze, his eyes didn't waver from hers. He'd had enough of cowering. Enough to last a lifetime. Well, that's the problem, he shot back. I don't respect the institution. I loathe it. Because I'm not a soldier, nor have I ever wanted to be one. Even if I did believe that it was for some nebulous greater good. Which he didn't. Not after all the things he'd seen. While he didn't think the Imperium was evil, it was far from a force for good. The democratic governments of old Earth hadn't been perfect. Far from it. But at least they hadn't glorified institutions of inequality. Even if it had been rife, there at least had been the acknowledgement that it was wrong. And for once in his life, he was willing to understand those people who wanted to fight for a return to how things were, rather than bow to a system they couldn't agree with. He still thought it was a fool's errand, but he understood. He was jostled from his thoughts by the woman continuing, Well, regardless of what you think of me or the Imperium, you've saved a lot of lives in your time in uniform. That deserves some respect, which is why I'm letting you go, against the wishes of a number of my colleagues. She stood up, very clearly not offering her hand. I wish you well, Jason Linford, wherever you end up. Jason just nodded, before finally stepping past her, and towards the outside. A free man. You came. Yrrol stood across from him in her dress uniform. While she'd not received an offer to join the Imperium's Officer Corps, she'd still been given an invitation to the event as one of the few members of the regiment who were still on planet. Though he doubted that would remain the case for long now that he'd effectively torpedoed the Imperium's plans for him. No, with his resignation from the military, Jason had a feeling Yrrol's time as a bodyguard was at an end. She'd likely be returning to the same role she'd occupied before he'd come into her life. Though he had to wonder if that would mean a return to the dead-end posting that was Guruthu. Not that the Rakira's future career trajectory was his current foremost concern. I did, she allowed. I even managed to slip out in the confusion you created with your little exit speech. Her tone was entirely flat, and he couldn't help but feel some of his excitement with her, at the reminder that he'd just essentially shat all over the Imperial military with his words. An Imperial military that Yrrol very much believed in. As evidenced by her actions the last time they'd met face to face. Given he had spent the last 2 months alternately being metaphorically tied to the interrogation chair or attending meetings, he'd not exactly had the opportunity to chat with her. Not that he hadn't tried, he certainly had. Unfortunately for him, it seemed Yrrol was trying just as hard to avoid him in those few moments he'd had available. She'd certainly not come back to their shared apartment. Raisha and Kernathu had told him not to worry, that she'd come around eventually, that she just needed some time alone. Jason wasn't so sure, which is why he couldn't help but feel, well, a number of conflicting feelings now that she was standing right in front of him. Ah, he said awkwardly, for lack of anything else to say. It's fine, Yrrol surprised him, as she shook her head ruefully, ears flicking atop her head. I knew what you were, or I should have. I suppose part of me was deceiving myself whenever I thought you might be coming around. You certainly never made your feelings on the military unclear when we were in private. Jason nodded, absently. He certainly hadn't, which made things more than a little awkward on a few occasions, given that he lived in a household populated entirely by active service members. Though not as awkward as it could have been. Raisha was enthused about the military, but that enthusiasm was more related to her position in it and what that position allowed her to do. Essentially, pilot exos and shoot bad guys. Deeper ruminations on who those bad guys were, and the wider ramifications of the Imperium, were not something she often pondered, which she wouldn't deny was one of the things he both loved about her, and was frustrated by in equal measure. For Kernathu, her job was exactly that, a job. Little more than a means to acquire a paycheck doing something she was good at, and perhaps cover for her own insecurities about what would have been considered masculinity back on Earth. For Tarsil, the military was an escape from the common expectations of a male around marriageable age. Beyond that, Jason had little idea about what his fellow males' thoughts on the wider Imperium were. Like so many other things he thought about, the small Shorvanti could be deceptively tight-lipped on the issue. Yrrol sighed. I can't deny, though, that some part of me hoped you were merely grousing. like you often do. After all, how could a man who was so critical of the Imperium stomach acting so positively when in public? Jason shrugged. He couldn't exactly blame her for being confused by that. Few people could compartmentalize like he could. Push their real feelings down. Although apparently even I have limits on that front, he thought, glancing back to the lecture hall. And perhaps I might have been served airing some of those grievances earlier, rather waiting for them to explode. Certainly, a few mutinous comments prior to this would have been rather satisfying, and likely a lot less hazardous to life and limb. Yet he couldn't quite bring himself to regret his most recent actions. After all, they had been rather satisfying. Though I wonder if I'll still be able to say that when the consequences of tonight finally come round to bite me in the ass, he thought, idly glancing in the direction of one of said consequences. For his part, he'd already forgiven Yrrol. Some part of him liked to think that was his more tolerant nature shining through, but a greater part of him had to concede that it was likely more down to him getting his way in that debate, while Yrrol had been forced to take an impromptu nap. I never wanted to be a Marine, he said finally. I was conscripted, forced to make a choice between military service and prison. To his surprise, Yrrol wasn't. I know. I did a little research on you when we started getting intimate. Despite the situation, he couldn't help but enjoy the way her tail flicked, and her ears twitched at the words, an action only another Rakiri, or someone very familiar with one, would be able to interpret as the equivalent of an involuntary blush. Your fight video is less popular in the wider datanet than it is on Earth, but it's still not hard to find. And while the propaganda office did a decent job of spinning your motivations for picking that fight, for someone who knows you, well, it's not hard to guess what series of events occurred. She smiled at him. It's amusing to think that despite all the trouble it's gotten you into, you still have trouble holding your drink. Jason smiled back ruefully. I like to think I've gotten better at pacing myself. You mean you've had less opportunity to get wasted? Rakiri shook her head with a scoff. Jason smiled back at her, and just for a moment he could fool himself into thinking that things were going to be okay. Of course, it didn't last, because for all his other faults, he was a realist. I'm not a soldier, he said finally. I know. Yrrol's smile turned distinctly sad. A soldier's all I ever wanted to be. Ever since I knew what one was. A noble knight, journeying the stars as a defender of the peace and the defenseless. Jason shook his head, some small irritation flaring in his gut. The Imperium hardly keeps the peace. Yrrol cocked her head. Don't they? Where the Consortium seeks only profit and the Alliance care nothing for the worlds beyond their borders, the Imperium acts. To expand those borders. Perhaps, she allowed. But the end result is the same. I cannot claim the Imperium is perfect, but the average Imperial citizen lives a much better life than most. Call it vanity or pride, but the Imperium cares for the state of its people. None go without education, food or homes. No threat to them is tolerated. Except perhaps from those within their borders, provided they have the right blood, he pointed out. Yrrol's tail swished in a shrug. As I said, the Imperium is not perfect, yet that will change with time. With each passing decade, more and more power is allocated to the common woman. More and more of the nobility's protections get repealed. Can you claim that 1,000 years from now, the 1,000 petty kingdoms beyond the Imperium's borders would still be squabbling over the same old divides? Race, religion, tribe? Jason couldn't deny that. On either account. The periphery was the kind of mess that made the Balkans look positively civilized. And the Imperium was advancing, imitating the social advances of humanity. But it was slow. So very slow. The Rakiri had been part of the Imperium for just over 200 years, and yet were in dozens of ways still second-class citizens, according to law. How long would it take for the Imperium to do away with the ridiculous farce of superiority through blood entirely? Another 1,000 years? 10? He couldn't stomach a lifetime of that. Hell, he hadn't been able to stomach 2 years. So no. While he could understand Yrrol's point of view, he couldn't bring himself to imitate it. Not least of all because he thought it was horribly naive. After all, who was to say the Imperium wouldn't backtrack on those social advances, or simply plateau one day? He had a feeling she wasn't here to argue with him about Imperial policy, though. It was just a prelude to what they were both avoiding. Unfortunately for both of them, he'd never been much good at putting things off. Are we? He asked slowly. Yrrol smiled sadly. I think we should take a break. She spoke resolutely, but not unkindly. If for no other reason than I think our lives are about to go in rapidly different directions. Jason's heart fell, but he couldn't find it in himself to argue. He long since forgiven Yrrol for trying to stop him pulling off his insane plan, just as it seemed Yrrol had forgiven him. Still, there was no denying that a rift had grown between them. Perhaps it was just a realization that they held radically different beliefs. It wasn't something he didn't think they'd have been able to overcome, if it weren't for the fact that they'd soon be separated by who knew how many light years. Distance was already enough of a strain on a relationship. For one that was already being strained, it might as well be a death knell. Better to break things off cleanly now, he thought. Still, he felt like a coward and a traitor as he smiled sadly back at her. If you think that's best. It was a strange thing, to hope that he both did and didn't see disappointment in her posture, as she nodded quietly. I do. I know, it's... Her words trailed off as her eyes aligned on something over his shoulder, her somewhat sad expression shifting into a scowl. He was about to turn to see what had distracted her when she continued. Regardless of everything that's happened, I hope you do well for yourself, Jason, wherever you end up. Then she was gone, hurrying back down the path, an almost unseemly haste in her usually measured gait. Huh. Part of me thought she'd stick around for a bit longer, if only to give you a piece of her mind. Nora, Jason sighed, turning around to find the woman behind him. He shouldn't have been surprised to see her. She'd been backstage with him, after all, ready to accept her own award for her heroics in the final hours of the Battle of Ragnos 3. Something to do with taking out an exo. With a knife. Something that sounded more and more comical the more he heard it. Unfortunately to hear Nora tell it, it hadn't been particularly comical at all. More just desperate. I'm surprised you managed to sneak out after the shit show I caused, he smirked, before turning serious. How are things back there? The woman shrugged, which he knew from experience was damn hard in Imperial dress uniform. Oh, about what you would expect. Our fellow Terran First Vets are confused, and angry. At you, or the shill, or you and the shill, or at each other for being angry about the wrong one of the first two. She parted hands. It all very nearly turned into a riot when you got dragged off stage by that shill ape. Fortunately, Frisker managed to do some quick talking, and mentioned that you weren't being arrested. Just taken aside for clarification on your unexpected statements. Jason scoffed. Taken aside? I was tackled and dragged off stage. The Norwegian woman just shrugged again. Perhaps if someone had thrown that first punch, things might have kicked off. It was on a razor blade for a while there. Fortunately, no one seemed willing to be the one to get the ball rolling, and likely get their commission revoked. She eyed him. Though with what you just said and did, that might still happen for a number of people. This time, it was his turn to shrug. I'm not sorry. She sighed, looking off to the side. I didn't really expect you to be, and if I'm telling the truth, I don't really want you to be. Jason eyed her, as she continued. Look, you may have been a dumbass in how you went about it, but nothing you said was wrong. From what I've seen of the Imperial Marines, they're a total shitshow compared to the Navy, which I can only see as an unfortunate byproduct of the Imperial's obsession with naval power, to the exclusion of all else. By contrast, the Marines have been left to flounder in the wind. The way I see it, so long as the Marines are at least a single step above the goddamn militia, the brass are content to let them be. Jason nodded absently. Truth be told, he'd never looked at it that way. Sure, he'd always known that the Marines were considered little more than afterthought compared to the Navy, but he'd never really thought of them as akin to being a slightly better trained and equipped version of the Imperial Militia, who were themselves essentially just the private army of whichever noble owned the territory they were based in. With all the incredibly disparate and eclectic levels of funding and competence that entailed. My point is, we've got a war coming, and the Imperium needs to start shaping up before a lot more people die for stupid reasons. I'm hoping your little wake-up call today might be the step in the face the Imperium needs to inject some goddamn professionalism back into its professional military. Jason just stared at the woman, who had been actively shouting by the end of her rant. Clearly she'd been keeping a lot of that bottled up in surprise. Obviously he wasn't the only one who'd been surprised by it either, given the way Nora suddenly flushed, glancing around to make sure no one had heard her. Fortunately, given it was late evening, and most people present were attending the awards ceremony, the Blackstone didn't have much in the way of foot traffic around. Content that she just hadn't blown her career up alongside his, Nora looked back to him. My point is, good luck, Jason. And good work. With all of it. Jason could scarcely believe his ears, as a woman who he thought kind of hated his guts gave him a very much against protocol salute, before marching back the way she came. It was only after she'd gone a few meters away that he shook out of his stupor. I don't need luck. You're the one who's still in the military. You'll need it more than me. I'm a civilian. I'm an easy streak now. Some part of me doubts that, she called back, without stopping or turning around. You're Chad Novikov. Trouble follows you like a bitch in heat. That's a ridiculous name. It'll never catch on, he scoffed. Of all the ridiculous monikers he'd picked up, the one his fellow veterans had coined, even over caveman, was the most ridiculous. As he turned to leave, he also scoffed at the parting words. His ex-bodyguard was wrong. He was on easy street now. His life going forward would be a nice malaise of boredom and safety. Sure, he'd probably copped some kind of crap for his earlier words, but that was it. There was no law against badmouthing the military, if the person doing so was a civilian. Sure, the Imperium didn't exactly enshrine free speech, but they weren't too tyrannical about it either. Because while the Imperium had a hard-on for censorship, it was of the more subtle variety. They bought out large news companies and rigged search engine algorithms. They didn't generally bust down doors and drag people out into the night with a black mask over their head. Predominantly because there had been a time when the Interior had done just that, and no one wanted to return to those days. Not even the nobility, which said a lot about just how bad it had been. So no, he was a free man, and he was going to enjoy every moment of it. Provided I somehow survive explaining all of this to the other members of my harem, he thought. You're fine with it? Jason most definitely did not shriek. It was a close-run thing, though. I don't know what else you want us to say, Yrrol opined from her position on their apartment couch. Next to her, Kernithu nodded absently. I don't get why you're complaining. Do you want us to be mad? Of course I don't, he thought. Do I? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. No, he didn't. He just wanted these damn aliens to finally have a reaction he could anticipate, rather than throw him for a loop every time something like this happened. Tarsal, please, Jason said, turning to the alien male. Be the voice of reason here. In his seat, about as far away from the females in the apartment as possible, the effeminate Marine cocked an eyebrow. So, by saying that, you're tacitly admitting that your actions were entirely unreasonable? Jason's mouth shut with a click before he muttered, I didn't say that. Tarsal just exhaled noisily. I'm with the others. I'm not against what you did. Jason opened his mouth to speak before the alien overrode him. I am, however, against how you did it. Insulting an Imperial princess? Most of the alumni of the Blackstone? Deebs, a good chunk of the Imperial military? You've painted a big target on your back. And by extension, ours. Jason had enough shame to be ashamed as he glanced at the floor, even as Yrrol and Kernithu started to argue against Tarsal's assertions. Personally, he agreed with his fellow male. And while he would have liked to say he hadn't thought of what his actions would do to the people around him, that would be a lie. He thought about it and decided to do it anyway. Fortunately for him, Tarsal continued on, taking on a slightly commiserating tone. Still, the event might prove enough of a black eye for the military that they start looking at how much the nobles in their ranks are getting away with. Jason cocked his head. He supposed that there was certainly some truth to that. A lot of the things that had happened to him happened because of people bending or breaking the rules. Some might have found that notion mollifying. Jason wasn't one of them. To him, it was only further infuriating, because it implied that the Imperium knew said behaviour was wrong and made no effort to correct it, or was utterly ineffective in doing so. Neither were palatable. Oh, like the Iron Tooth, Yrrol pointed out. They made a lot of changes after that came out. Tarsal's mood, which had bordered on contemplative up until our interruption, turned decidedly grim. Yes, that would be an excellent example. Jason almost winced at the other male's flat tone. He knew he'd copped a lot of shit during his time in the military, for being a human, male, or just him. Now he had to wonder if the same was true for Tarsal. In that regard, his lack of irritation at Jason's airing the military's dirty laundry made a lot more sense. Well, that, and the fact that his only male friend had always had his back. He shook his head, returning his mind to the topic at hand. So, if I'm reading the room correctly, none of you are about to break up with me to avoid the inevitable fallout that's going to come with my little truth-telling session? No! The shouts from Yrrol and Kernithu were almost simultaneous, to such a degree that both looked a little embarrassed by the outburst. Yrrol glanced at her fellow female before looking back at him. Look, Jason, I'm already a commoner in the exopilot thingy. I doubt being in a relationship with you is going to make the bullying any worse. Jason cocked his head. Huh. I've never really thought about that. There's two people in my life who are apparently also suffering under the Imperium's issues. And they were both shill. To Yrrol's right, Kernithu shrugged. Meh. Yrrol cops most of the fire for being a commoner from the other cadets. As an engineer, I'm pretty beneath the notice of the noble bloods. I doubt that'll change. Jason nodded slowly, before almost turning to where Yrrol usually sat, only to remember that she wasn't there. Hell, even before their little heart-to-heart the other night, the recruiting woman had taken to sleeping elsewhere. Which was wise, because it had kept her name almost entirely out of the news when the reporters had shown up. Or are they paparazzi? He wondered. To be honest, he wasn't totally sure of the difference. What he did know was that he had a sizable number of them camped outside his door. They'd shown up a few hours ago, and had yet to leave. It was more than a little unnerving for a man that had been hoping to escape the limelight. Instead, it seemed he'd only made it worse. Because while his fame hadn't gained much traction outside of military circles, his quitting of those circles certainly had. At least on Shill. Even a casual perusal of the datanet had seen his face plastered across dozens of news channels, which had been surprising, but not nearly as surprising that some of those channels seemed to be, if not in his favour, at least sympathetic to the issues he'd raised. Part of him liked to believe that was due to the legitimacy of his complaints, but a darker side of him couldn't help but wonder if it didn't have something to do with his gender. Of course, a few news channels weren't much in the grand scheme of things. Most were lambasting his actions and disrespect. Still, enough were in his favour that there was an argument rather than universal condemnation. Hell, he'd even seen a few ex-service members echoing his sentiments in interviews, albeit with much more delicate language. The amount of discussion he managed to generate might have been heartening, if it weren't for the fact that he didn't want anything to do with any of it. He was out of the game now. He'd made his stand. He'd saved some lives. He'd given his post-career review. 2 stars. Poon was nice, but did not justify the risk to life and limb. Now he just wanted to slink away. Back to the quiet, normal life he'd been on track to enjoy before he'd been dumb enough to punch a Marine in the face, and get recorded doing so. Unfortunately, the universe didn't seem quite so keen to let go of him. Here's hoping Tass was right and this all blows over the moment the next scandal big story comes along, he thought. Which hopefully wouldn't take too long. Man insults princess had a nice ring to it, but it had nothing on the possibility of war on the horizon. Already stories were circulating about the Imperium and the Alliance moving to a war footing. His little scandal might have momentarily interrupted that story, but soon enough the media was switched back to talking about the coming conflict. A conflict that was looking to be the biggest in galactic history, with this being the first time 2 superpowers were going to war. He had no doubt the consortium would be looking on gleefully from the sidelines, hoping to sell to both sides and pour fuel on the fire wherever they could. They only stood to benefit from their 2 main rivals weakening each other, which is what had kept the uneasy peace for so long. The fact that, if any 2 powers started fighting, the third would be able to tip the scale in either direction. Unfortunately, with the events of Ragnos 3, the Imperium was required to respond. They literally couldn't choose not to. Not unless the Empress wanted to take a massive hit to her prestige. No. Black Flag operation or not, the Alliance had committed an act of war, and the Empress was obligated to respond. And they knew for a fact that it was the Alliance now. According to Frisker, one of the prisoners had finally broken. How she found out about it he didn't know, nor did he want to. All that mattered was that they found what the Adixi had been doing on Ragnos 3, and how they planned to escape with an Imperial fleet in orbit. Apparently, like they suspected, the Roche attack had merely been bait for an Imperial response. Once the Imperial relief force arrived and were sufficiently committed, the Adixi had broken out their new jamming system. One adapted to make use of the unique environment of Ragnos, to be as effective as possible. Then they'd set to work, testing weapons for the inevitable conflict with the Imperium. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy, he thought. It made him sick. All those people that had died, they died as part of a field test. A field test that had now guaranteed that the thing that it was prepared for was now going to happen. Much sooner than he imagined anyone in the Alliance, or the Imperium for that matter, would have liked. Imperium was still consolidating its conquests, Earth included, and the Alliance was still standardizing. Though to be fair, that had been the case for the entirety of its existence. Unlike the Imperium, the Alliance wasn't a monolith. It contained lots of voices and agendas. What was that saying? The cow was the racehorse designed by committee? He shook his head. As for how the Adixi were to escape? That was simple. A few weeks after Jason's escape, and mere hours after Imperial reinforcements had shown up in system in force, a roach pirate fleet had jumped in, and probably jumped out again after seeing the force arrayed against it. Still, it was clear for all to see that the pirates had been the Adixi's intended extraction plan. While it was near impossible to force an engagement in space with an enemy that didn't want one, they'd just run in the opposite direction. They could have forced the Imperial fleet out of orbit long enough for them to extract their people and the Alliance Special Forces before jumping from the system, leaving the Imperial fleet powers to stop them, and utterly ignorant of the fact that there had been Alliance troops on the ground at all. To Jason's eyes, it was a plan that seemed fraught with risk for gains that could have been imitated, if to a lesser degree, with war games. The timing of the Roach's fleet arrival, for example, seemed incredibly late. Late enough that it suggested there'd been some issue there, which he supposed was only to be expected when you based your super-secret Black Ops operation around the timeliness and professionalism of pirates and terrorists. He could only wonder what the heads of the Alliance had been thinking when they cooked this plan up. Hell, for all he knew, it hadn't even been the heads of the Alliance, just some Black Ops spook that had overreached. Regardless, war was now inevitable. He glanced around the table. And the people with me will be right in the middle of it, he thought. So, what are you going to do? Yrrol asked suddenly, jolting him from his thoughts. The alien woman had a small smirk on her face as she eyed him. Settle down and be a house husband for us? Jason just shook his head and laughed, much to her poorly concealed disappointment. Ah, no. I go crazy in a week. Did that beg the question? What did he want to do? It was funny. He spent what felt like months thinking about nothing more than escaping the military, but now that he was out, he had no idea what he should do. Go back to Earth, he thought. Not a chance. I'd be killed in a week by some nutjob freedom fighter after being labelled as a collaborator. Stay in the Imperium? He shook his head. That's probably not a good idea either. I've just pissed off an Imperial princess. Perhaps I could lie low on one of the border worlds. Guruthu would probably be happy to see him. You could try the Periphery. Every eye in the room logged onto Tarsal at his quiet suggestion. Naturally, Yrrol was the first to speak. The Periphery? Are you insane? The alien male shot his fellow shield the stink eye. I'm not. If you let me finish, I'll explain why. As if dismissing her completely, he turned back to Jason. The Periphery might have a bad reputation, much of it well earned, but I spent the last few months on a posting out there, and it's not as bad as it sounds. Mostly. While much of it is a mess, there's plenty of safe worlds out there that are Imperial aligned. Jason resisted the urge to snort. Imperial aligned just meant that, while they were still technically sovereign nations, they were in the process of being diplomatically annexed by the Imperium. One military base or trading post at a time. In the same fashion as the British Empire did, way back in the colonial era. Still, underhanded or not, the Imperium would take a firm hand to any pirate admiral or warlord who decided to try and take a swipe at a world they had an interest in. And that was the only reason those otherwise sovereign nations tolerated Imperial troops operating on their worlds. Worlds like that, they're desperate for skilled... anything, really, Tarsal continued, but they're especially eager for people familiar with Imperial tech. From across the room, Guruthu made a considering noise. Being on the frontier would keep you safe from the interior, military and ordinary nobles, she paused, ignoring the betrayed look Yrrol was sending her way. Or at least, safer. Safer? Jason deadpanned. The look his fellow engineer sent him was somehow even flatter. You were the one that insulted an Imperial princess, not me. Safest relative. Well, he couldn't argue that. The Periphery, eh? He said, ignoring Yrrol's pout. He couldn't deny the idea appealed. It was an opportunity to get out from under the Imperium's thumb, and some part of him was excited to see a world that didn't belong to the Imperium. There'd be new races, new technology, and an opportunity to see those things in a setting where he wasn't either shooting at them or being shot at by them. Most importantly, his skills would finally be useful. He turned back to eye the rest of the room. Well, I suppose it's worth a shot. After all, what was the worst that could happen?